I was scrolling through Facebook that Tuesday morning when I saw a post that made my coffee go cold. A woman named Patricia from Phoenix had shared her heartbreak about Mother's Day. Her adult daughter had sent a brutal text message saying she was done pretending their relationship mattered, and that Patricia had never been the mother she needed. The comments were flooding in with support and outrage. How could a daughter be so cruel? What kind of person destroys their mother on Mother's Day? People were calling the daughter ungrateful, heartless, a monster. What made my hands shake wasn't just the cruelty of that story. It was that I was reading it while sitting in my kitchen in Riverside, California, still reeling from the exact same words my own son David had said to me just 3 days ago. But here's what David didn't know. When he delivered that devastating blow on what was supposed to be my special day, he had no idea that I'd already discovered the truth about what he and Jessica had been doing with the $95,000 I'd given them from my teacher's retirement fund. He didn't know I'd been quietly documenting everything for weeks. Most importantly, he had no idea that his cruel words would be the final push I needed to do something I should have done years ago. Prove him absolutely right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and at 68 years old, I thought, I knew what family meant. For 4 decades, I'd taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary in Riverside, watching other people's children learn to read, helping them navigate playground conflicts, and celebrating their small victories. I'd always believed that love, patience, and sacrifice were the foundations of good parenting. I'd built my entire identity around being the kind of mother who was always there, always giving, always putting her son's needs before her own. After my husband Tom passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, David became the center of my world. Tom and I had only been blessed with 1 child, and David was everything to us. We'd supported him through college, helped with his wedding expenses, babied him when he struggled to find his footing in his career. When Tom died, I threw myself even more into being the perfect mother and grandmother. I wanted to honor Tom's memory by making sure our son never felt alone or unsupported. Living in my cozy 2-bedroom townhouse in Sunset Gardens, I'd created what I thought was a peaceful retirement. The community was perfect for someone like me, full of other widowed women who understood the challenges of navigating life alone after decades of marriage. I had my book club on Tuesdays, water aerobics on Thursdays, and bridge games every Saturday afternoon. My little garden behind the townhouse was my pride and joy, especially the rose bushes that bloomed magnificently each spring. But the real joy in my life came from my relationship with David and his family. My son had done well for himself, working as a marketing executive at a firm in Irvine. He'd married Jessica 8 years ago, a real estate agent who seemed devoted to making their Newport Beach home picture perfect. Together, they'd given me 2 precious grandchildren, Lily, who was 10 and had inherited my love for reading, and Mason, 7 years old and full of energy like his father had been at that age. I'd always been the grandmother who remembered every school play, every soccer game, every art project. I drove the hour from Riverside to Newport Beach at least twice a month, sometimes more. Jessica would often call when she needed someone to watch the kids during showings, and I'd drop everything to help. When David complained about work stress, I'd listen for hours and offer encouragement. When money got tight, I was always ready to help with whatever they needed. Looking back now, I can see that I'd been groomed for what happened next. For years, David and Jessica had been training me to be their emotional and financial safety net. Every crisis, every request for help, every expression of gratitude had been carefully calculated to keep me invested in their lives while maintaining just enough distance to prevent me from seeing what was really going on. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday evening in February. I was settling in with a cup of tea and the latest novel from my book club when David's name appeared on my phone screen. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was seriously wrong. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the strain immediately. "I need to talk to you about something, and I'm really hoping you can help us out." I set down my tea, giving him my complete attention. "Of course, sweetheart. What's going on?" "It's Jessica's real estate license," he said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine distress. "There was some kind of mix-up with the state board. They're claiming she didn't complete some continuing education requirements, and they've suspended her license pending an investigation." My heart sank for them. Jessica's real estate career had been going so well, especially with the booming California market. "Oh no, David. How long will the investigation take?" "That's the problem, Mom. It could be months. And without her income, we're looking at some serious financial trouble. The mortgage on the house, Lily's piano lessons, Mason's soccer league, our car payments. We've been living on both our incomes, and losing Jessica's commission checks is going to be devastating." I felt that familiar maternal instinct kick in, the same feeling I'd had when David was small and came to me with scraped knees or hurt feelings. "How much do you need, honey?" There was a pause, and I could hear him take a shaky breath. "Mom, I hate asking this of you, especially when you're on a fixed income. But we need about $95,000 to cover our expenses and keep up with the mortgage until Jessica can get her license reinstated. I know it's a lot, but you're the only person we can turn to. The kids would be heartbroken if we had to downsize or move them to a different school district." $95,000. It was a substantial portion of my retirement savings. Money I'd been carefully managing since Tom's death to ensure I could maintain my independence for the rest of my life. But the thought of my grandchildren losing their home, their stability, their familiar life, made the decision feel obvious. "David, of course I'll help," I said without hesitation. "Family takes care of family." I could hear the relief in his voice. "Mom, you're saving our lives. Jessica is going to cry when I tell her. We'll pay every penny back as soon as her license is reinstated. With interest, of course." That weekend, I drove to Newport Beach to discuss the details in person. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I told myself I was overthinking things. They were dealing with a stressful situation, and stress could make people withdraw and become protective of their energy. Jessica was probably embarrassed about the licensing issue and didn't want me to see her struggling. David was likely feeling the pressure of carrying the full financial load and didn't want to burden me with his worries. The wake-up call came in late April, when I tried calling David on a Thursday afternoon, and 10-year-old Lily answered his phone. "Grandma Sarah!" she exclaimed with the genuine excitement I'd been missing from her parents. "I miss you so much. When are you coming to visit? I have so many drawings to show you, and I learned a new song on the piano." My heart melted at her enthusiasm. "I miss you too, sweetheart. I'd love to hear your new song. Has Daddy mentioned when might be a good time for me to visit?" "Oh, Daddy keeps saying you're too busy with your senior stuff," Lily said matter-of-factly. "But I told him you're never too busy for us. Can you come this weekend? We could have a sleepover like we used to." Before I could respond, I heard David's voice in the background, sharp and urgent. "Lily, give me the phone right now." "Hi, Mom," David said, slightly breathless. "Sorry, Lily grabbed my phone while I was in the bathroom. You know how kids are with phones." My mind was reeling from what Lily had said. "David, Lily seems to think I've been too busy to visit. What have you been telling the children?" There was a long pause that felt loaded with tension. "Mom, you know how kids mix things up. They don't really understand adult scheduling issues." "But David, I've suggested several visits, and you've said it wasn't a good time. I haven't been too busy. You've been too busy for me." "Look, Mom," David said, his tone becoming more clipped. "I'm actually heading into a meeting right now. Can I call you back later?" He never called back that day. or the next. When I finally reached him on Saturday, he was polite but distant, giving me a brief update about work and Jessica's ongoing licensing situation, but nothing about the children or any possibility of a visit. That's when I realized something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, and I needed to understand what was really going on. If David and Jessica were struggling financially and emotionally, I wanted to help in whatever way I could. But if they were pulling away from me for other reasons, I deserved to know what those reasons were. The following Tuesday, I made a decision that would ultimately change everything. Instead of waiting for another invitation that might never come, I would drive to Newport Beach and surprise them with a visit. If they were going through a difficult time, maybe they just needed to see that I was there for them unconditionally. If there was some other reason for their distance, a face-to-face conversation would help us work through it. I packed a small overnight bag and filled a cooler with homemade chocolate chip cookies, the kind Lily and Mason had always loved. I stopped at Target and bought small gifts for the children. A new set of colored pencils for Lily's artwork and a soccer ball for Mason. Whatever was going on with David and Jessica, I wasn't going to let it affect my relationship with my grandchildren. The drive from Riverside to Newport Beach took just over an hour, and I spent it imagining the children's surprised delight when they saw me at the door. Maybe David and Jessica had been trying to protect me from their stress, not realizing that I wanted to share their burdens, not avoid them. Maybe this surprise visit would remind us all what family was supposed to be about, being there for each other through good times and bad. But when I pulled into their driveway that sunny Saturday afternoon, the scene in front of me shattered all my hopeful assumptions about what I would find. The house looked nothing like what I'd expected from a family supposedly struggling through a financial crisis. The manicured lawn was absolutely pristine, clearly maintained by professional landscapers rather than showing signs of cost-cutting measures. The flower beds were filled with expensive seasonal plantings that would have cost hundreds of dollars. Most shocking of all, there was a brand new silver Mercedes SUV parked in the driveway next to David's familiar truck. A Mercedes. While Jessica was supposedly unable to work and they were living on David's salary alone. I sat in my car for several minutes, staring at the vehicle and trying to process what I was seeing. The license plate frame read, Newport Beach Mercedes, indicating it had been purchased locally. This wasn't some older used vehicle they'd bought to get by during tough times. This was a current year model that would have cost at least $60,000. Through the large front windows, I could see into their living room, which had been completely redecorated since my last visit in February. The furniture I remembered had been replaced with what appeared to be a matching leather sectional and a massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. New artwork hung in expensive-looking frames, and I could see fresh flowers arranged in what looked like crystal vases. This wasn't the home of a family cutting back on expenses. This was the home of people who had recently spent a considerable amount of money on luxury upgrades. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear laughter and conversation coming from the backyard. The voices were too distant to make out individual words, but the tone was light and celebratory, not the stressed discussions of people facing financial hardship. I rang the doorbell and waited, my heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. After a moment, I heard Jessica's voice call out, "David, can you get that? I'm busy arranging the appetizers for our guests." Guests. They were entertaining while supposedly struggling to make ends meet on a single income. David opened the door, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw me was unmistakable shock, followed quickly by what looked like panic. For just a split second, before he could compose himself, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice slightly strained. "What are you doing here? We weren't expecting you." "I wanted to surprise you and the kids," I said, trying to keep my voice light despite the churning in my stomach. David and Jessica's house always impressed me with its modern elegance and spectacular location just minutes from the beach. The mortgage payment alone was more than my entire monthly income, but they'd worked hard to achieve their lifestyle. and I was proud of their success. Jessica hugged me tightly when I arrived, tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I can't believe this is happening," she said, leading me into their pristine kitchen. 20 years of building my reputation, and now this. Bureaucratic nightmare threatens everything. We sat around their granite island while Jessica explained the situation in more detail. According to her, there had been a computer glitch that failed to record her completion of required courses. She'd been working with lawyers to prove she'd met all the requirements, but the state board was notoriously slow to resolve these issues. "The worst part," Jessica said, "is that I have 3 major listings that I'll have to turn over to other agents. That's potentially $80,000 in commissions down the drain." David nodded grimly. "And the timing couldn't be worse. We just finished the kitchen renovation, and we'd been planning to use Jessica's spring commissions to pay off the credit cards we used for materials." Looking around at their beautiful kitchen with its custom cabinets and high-end appliances, I felt even more determined to help them through this crisis. These were good people who'd worked hard for what they had. A bureaucratic mistake shouldn't destroy their financial stability. The next Monday, I met with my financial advisor at Edward Jones to discuss liquidating part of my retirement portfolio. Tom had been meticulous about our financial planning, and even after his death, I'd maintained a conservative approach that had served me well. The $95,000 would come primarily from a CD that was about to mature anyway, along with some stock, holdings that had performed better than expected. However, I wasn't naive about lending money, even to family. Tom had taught me to always protect myself in financial dealings, and I'd learned from his business experience that even the most well-intentioned borrowers could face unexpected circumstances. I asked my attorney, Patricia Wells, to draw up a simple loan agreement. Patricia had handled Tom's estate and had become a trusted advisor over the years. She was a practical woman in her 60s who understood both the emotional and legal complexities of family financial arrangements. "Sarah," Patricia said as we reviewed the loan documents, "I always recommend formalizing these arrangements, even with family members. It protects everyone involved and prevents misunderstandings down the line." The agreement was straightforward. $95,000 loaned to David and Jessica Mitchell, to be repaid within 24 months at a modest interest rate. As collateral, I would hold a lien on their Newport Beach property until the loan was satisfied. The terms were generous, far more favorable than anything they could have gotten from a bank, but they provided me with legal protection if something went wrong. When I presented the paperwork to David and Jessica, I could see a flicker of surprise cross their faces. David recovered quickly, signing the documents without complaint. "Mom, this is incredibly generous," he said, hugging me after we'd completed the paperwork. "You're not just helping us financially, you're probably saving our marriage from the stress this situation was putting on us." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "Sarah, I promise we'll have this paid back to you just as soon as I can get back to work. Probably within a year, definitely within the 2-year term." As I drove home to Riverside that evening, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from being able to help the people you love most. I'd given my son and his family the security they needed during a difficult time, and I'd done it in a way that protected my own interests. It seemed like the perfect solution to an unfortunate situation. What I didn't realize was that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. For the first month after the loan, everything seemed to proceed exactly as expected. David called every Sunday with updates on Jessica's situation with the state board. The investigation was proceeding slowly, he reported, but their lawyer was optimistic about a resolution. In the meantime, they were managing their finances carefully and were incredibly grateful for my support. Jessica sent me weekly text messages with photos of the children and updates on their activities. Lily had joined the school's advanced reading program and was working her way through the entire Nancy Drew series. Mason had scored his first goal in soccer and was beaming with pride in the photo Jessica sent me from the sidelines. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for giving us peace of mind during this stressful time, Jessica texted after Mason's soccer success. Knowing we don't have to worry about the mortgage lets us focus on the kids and getting through this licensing nightmare. I forwarded the photos to my sister Linda in Portland and my best friend Maggie at Sunset Gardens. Everyone commented on how happy and secure the children looked, and I felt proud that my sacrifice was helping preserve their childhood stability. But as February turned to March, I began to notice subtle changes in our communication patterns. David's Sunday calls became shorter and less frequent. When I did speak with him, he seemed distracted and often cut conversations short because they were heading out for activities or errands. "Sorry, Mom, we're meeting the Johnsons for dinner and we're already running late," he'd say. Or, "Can I call you back later? Lily has a friend coming over and I need to help Jessica get ready." The callbacks rarely came. Jessica's regular text messages also became sporadic. Instead of weekly photos and updates, I might get a quick message every 2 weeks with a brief update. "Kids doing great. Still waiting on the licensing board. Hope you're well." When I suggested visiting for Lily's birthday in March, David hesitated in a way that felt different from his usual enthusiasm for my visits. "Actually, Mom, this might not be the best weekend," he said carefully. "Jessica's parents are driving down from Sacramento, and you know how small the guest room is. Plus, Jessica's been really stressed about the licensing situation, and having too many people around might be overwhelming for her." I understood stress, of course, and I didn't want to add to Jessica's burden. But Carol and Frank Brennan had visited plenty of times when I was there, and we'd all gotten along well. The excuse felt strange, but I pushed down my doubts. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "Maybe the following weekend?" "Let me check with Jessica and get back to you," David said, but he never did. The pattern continued into April. Every suggestion I made for a visit was met with a polite excuse. Jessica was showing houses all weekend. David had a work conference. The kids were overwhelmed with school projects. Lily was coming down with something, and they didn't want me to catch it. I started to feel like I was being managed rather than included. Our conversations began to feel scripted, as if David was giving me just enough information to keep me satisfied without actually letting me into their lives. The spontaneous calls, the casual drop-ins, the easy familiarity we'd always shared seemed to have evaporated. I brought cookies and some little gifts for Lily and Mason. He glanced nervously over his shoulder toward the sound of voices in the backyard, then stepped aside reluctantly. "Of course, come in. It's just that we have some friends over, and we weren't really prepared for additional guests." As I stepped into the foyer, I could see Jessica in the kitchen through the open archway. She was indeed arranging what appeared to be an elaborate spread of appetizers on multiple serving platters. The food looked catered rather than homemade, and there was enough to feed a significant crowd. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something that looked designer and expensive. When Jessica noticed me, her face went through the same rapid transformation I'd seen in David's expression: surprise, panic, and then a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sarah," she said, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. "What a wonderful surprise. We didn't know you were coming." "I wanted to see my grandchildren," I said, looking around the beautifully appointed living room that bore no resemblance to the careful budgeting David had described, "and spend some time with all of you. It's been too long." The house was even more stunning than I'd remembered, but now I was seeing it through different eyes. The new furniture, the artwork, the completely renovated kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, the hardwood floors that gleamed with professional care. Every detail spoke of recent, significant investment. "Where are Lily and Mason?" I asked, setting down my purse and the bag of gifts I'd brought. "Oh, they're at friends' houses," David said quickly. "Lily is at a sleepover with her friend Madison, and Mason is at a birthday party for one of his soccer teammates. You know how busy their social calendars are." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. Both kids had plans today. They'll be so sorry. They missed you. Maybe next time you could give us a little advance notice so we can make sure they're available. Something felt fundamentally wrong about this explanation, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. The children's convenient absence, the obvious signs of recent spending, the nervous energy radiating from both David and Jessica. It all felt orchestrated somehow, as if I'd walked into a performance rather than a family home. Well, I don't have anywhere else to be, I said, settling into one of their new leather chairs. I can wait until they get home. I drove all the way from Riverside, so I'm in no hurry. I watched David and Jessica exchange a look, a quick worried glance that they probably thought I missed. It was the kind of look that passed between people who shared a secret, and suddenly I felt like an outsider in my own son's home. David cleared his throat. Actually, Mom, we have dinner plans tonight. Friends coming over for a barbecue. It's been planned for weeks and people are already starting to arrive. As if on cue, I could hear more voices joining the conversation in the backyard, along with the sound of what might have been a blender making cocktails. The barbecue Jessica mentioned? I said, remembering her comment about arranging appetizers. That sounds lovely. I'd be happy to meet your friends. Jessica looked genuinely panicked at this suggestion. Oh, Sarah, that's so sweet, but it's really just couples from our neighborhood. You know how those things can be, very focused on local gossip and community issues. You'd probably be bored to tears. Every suggestion I made was met with another excuse, another reason why it wouldn't work out. When I offered to take the children for ice cream the next day, Jessica reminded me that they had piano lessons and soccer practice. When I suggested meeting for lunch during the week, David mentioned that work had been incredibly demanding and he couldn't commit to social plans. After an hour of increasingly awkward conversation, it became crystal clear that I wasn't welcome to stay. They weren't even trying to hide their relief when I finally said I should probably head back to my hotel. We're so sorry the timing didn't work out, David said, practically escorting me to the door. Next time, maybe just give us a heads up so we can clear our schedules properly. As I walked back to my car, I felt physically sick. This wasn't the struggling family I'd been supporting for the past 3 months. This was a family that had used my money to upgrade their lifestyle while deliberately keeping me at arm's length. The Mercedes, the new furniture, the catered food, the designer clothes, it all painted a picture of people who were not only financially comfortable, but were actively spending money on luxury items. But even as the evidence mounted in front of me, part of me wanted to believe there was an explanation. Maybe Jessica had resolved her licensing issues and hadn't wanted to get my hopes up until everything was finalized. Maybe they'd come into some other money, an inheritance or a bonus, and were planning to surprise me by paying back the loan early. Maybe I was reading too much into a single awkward visit and jumping to unfair conclusions. I checked into a nearby hotel, telling myself I would extend my stay by a few days and do a little investigating before drawing any final conclusions. If David and Jessica were back on their feet financially, that was wonderful news. But I deserved to know the truth about my investment in their lives, and I deserved honest communication about our relationship. What I discovered over the next 3 days would shatter every assumption I'd made about my son and his wife. My first stop was the Orange County Recorder's Office, where public records could tell me whether there had been any recent changes to David and Jessica's mortgage or property status. What I found there was my first concrete proof that I'd been systematically lied to. There was no record of any financial distress or mortgage difficulties. In fact, quite the opposite was true. David and Jessica had refinanced their home just 1 month before calling me for help, pulling out additional equity in a cash-out refinance that had put approximately $60,000 in their pockets. They hadn't been facing foreclosure or struggling to make mortgage payments. They had accessed additional borrowing power based on their home's appreciation and had been sitting on a substantial sum of money when David called me in tears about their financial crisis. My hands were shaking as I requested copies of the refinancing documents. The paperwork showed that both David and Jessica had signed the loan documents, and both of their incomes had been verified as part of the approval process. Jessica's real estate income was listed at $127,000 for the previous year, with no indication of any licensing issues or work interruptions. The loan officer's notes indicated that the refinancing had been approved specifically because both borrowers had strong, stable income histories. Jessica's real estate license was listed as active and in good standing as of the date of the loan application. I drove back to my hotel in a daze, trying to process what I'd learned. Not only had David and Jessica lied to me about their financial situation, but they had actively borrowed additional money from their home equity while simultaneously asking me to liquidate my retirement savings to help them. The next morning, I decided to do something I'd never done before: investigate my own family. I hired a private investigator named Robert Hayes, whose office was located in nearby Irvine. Bob was a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases, and he came highly recommended by the attorney I'd contacted for a consultation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Bob said as we sat in his office reviewing what I'd discovered so far, "what you're describing sounds like a fairly sophisticated deception. If they've been planning this for any length of time, there will be additional evidence. With your permission, I'd like to look into their financial records, social media activity, and recent spending patterns." I authorized Bob to conduct a comprehensive investigation, signing papers that would allow him to access public records, conduct surveillance, and look into any financial trails that might reveal the scope of David and Jessica's deception. "I need to warn you," Bob said as I prepared to leave his office. "Sometimes what we discover isn't pleasant. Are you prepared for the possibility that this goes deeper than a simple lie about financial hardship?" I thought about David's panicked expression when he'd seen me at his door, about Jessica's nervous energy, about the obvious signs of recent luxury spending throughout their home. "Mr. Hayes," I said, "I've already discovered that my son looked me in the eye and lied about a financial crisis that didn't exist while taking nearly $100,000 of my retirement money. I think I'm prepared for whatever else you might find." I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't find out how wrong until Bob called me with his preliminary findings 2 days later. While Bob conducted his investigation, I spent the time doing my own research. I drove past David and Jessica's house several times, observing the patterns of their daily life. What I saw contradicted everything they'd told me about tightening their belts and cutting back on expenses. On Tuesday morning, I watched Jessica leave the house in her new Mercedes, dressed in what appeared to be expensive business attire. She was clearly working, not sitting at home waiting for her license to be reinstated. I followed her at a distance and watched as she met with clients at a Starbucks near the beach, conducting what was obviously a real estate consultation. That evening, I observed David arriving home in his truck, followed shortly by a delivery truck from an upscale furniture store. 2 men unloaded what appeared to be a new dining room set, carrying multiple boxes and carefully wrapped pieces into the house. Wednesday afternoon, I watched as Jessica returned home with several shopping bags from high-end stores in Fashion Island. Thursday evening, both David and Jessica left the house together, dressed for what looked like an expensive dinner date. This wasn't the behavior of people carefully managing their finances during a difficult period. This was the behavior of people who had recently come into a significant amount of money and were enjoying spending it. But the most heartbreaking discovery came on Thursday afternoon when I was sitting in my rental car down the street from their house, trying to process everything I'd observed. A school bus stopped at the corner, and I watched as Lily and Mason got off and walked home together. They hadn't been at sleepovers or birthday parties during my Saturday visit. They had been deliberately kept away from me, probably sent to friends' houses, or told to stay in their rooms while their parents entertained their guests. David and Jessica had used their own children as props in their deception, making sure I couldn't spend time with my grandchildren during what might have been my last opportunity to maintain a relationship with them. The realization that my son and daughter-in-law had manipulated their own children to avoid my presence was almost more devastating than the financial betrayal. Lily and Mason had been excited to see me, according to Lily's enthusiastic phone call weeks earlier. They had been asking about visits and wondering why I didn't come around anymore. Their parents had been lying to them too, telling them I was too busy with my senior stuff to make time for family. That evening, Bob Hayes called with preliminary findings that confirmed my worst fears and introduced new ones I hadn't even considered. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "I need you to sit down for this conversation. What I've discovered goes well beyond a simple case of financial deception." I gripped the phone tighter, steeling myself for whatever was coming. First, Jessica's real estate license has never been suspended or under investigation. She's been actively working throughout the period when you were told she couldn't earn income. In fact, her business has been quite successful. She closed 3 major sales in the past month alone, earning approximately $35,000 in commissions. My stomach dropped. So the entire premise for their financial crisis had been a complete fabrication. Second, the cash-out refinancing. I'm sure you've discovered by now was just the beginning. They've been systematically accessing credit and spending money at a rate that suggests they viewed your loan as supplemental income rather than emergency assistance. Bob paused, and I could hear him shuffling papers. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you something important. Did David or Jessica have access to any of your personal financial information? Bank account numbers, credit card information, anything like that?" The question sent a chill down my spine. "Well, yes. I've used my credit card for purchases when I've visited their house, and I've helped Jessica with some online shopping when she was having trouble with her computer." "Why do you ask?" "Because I've found evidence that suggests they may have been using your financial information for unauthorized purchases. Are you monitoring your credit card and bank statements carefully?" My hands started shaking. "What kind of purchases?" "I'll need to verify this with your bank records, but there appear to be several charges on credit cards linked to your name for purchases made at high-end retailers in the Newport Beach area. The timing corresponds with the furniture delivery and other luxury purchases I've documented at their residence." The room started spinning. Not only had David and Jessica lied to me about their financial crisis and taken my retirement money under false pretenses, but they had apparently been stealing from me directly, using my own credit cards to fund their lifestyle upgrades. "Mr. Hayes?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "How much money are we talking about?" "Based on what I can document so far, approximately $15,000 in unauthorized charges over the past 3 months. But Mrs. Mitchell, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. I need permission to dig deeper into their financial activities." I authorized Bob to continue his investigation, knowing that each new discovery was likely to be worse than the last, but I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done to me, both for my own financial protection and for my emotional processing of the betrayal. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I was no longer dealing with a family relationship that had gone wrong. I was dealing with criminal activity perpetrated by people who had used my love for them as a weapon against me. The next morning, I called my bank and credit card companies to report the unauthorized charges and request detailed statements for the past 6 months. What I discovered when those statements arrived made me physically ill. The theft had been going on longer than Bob had initially estimated. There were charges dating back to January, even before David's desperate phone call about Jessica's supposed licensing crisis. Charges at expensive restaurants, high-end clothing stores, electronics retailers, and luxury service providers. All made while I was sitting in my Riverside townhouse, believing that I was helping my struggling family through a difficult time. They had been systematically stealing from me for months, and then they had manipulated me into giving them nearly $100,000 more by fabricating a crisis that had never existed. But even as the evidence mounted, the worst was yet to come. Because David and Jessica weren't just thieves. They were also about to reveal themselves to be something much worse. People who were willing to destroy their own children's relationship with their grandmother to protect their criminal activities. The confrontation I'd been avoiding was about to become inevitable. And when it happened, it would strip away the last of my illusions about who my son really was. My sister Linda called that evening from Portland, and I found myself telling her everything I'd discovered. Linda had always been more cynical about people's motives than I was, and she'd never particularly warmed to David, though she'd kept her reservations to herself over the years. "Sarah," she said after I'd finished recounting Bob's findings, "I need to say something, and I hope you won't take it the wrong way." "Go ahead, Linda. At this point, I think I need to hear some hard truths." "This didn't happen overnight. People don't just suddenly become criminals who steal from their own mothers. There have probably been warning signs for years that you chose not to see because you wanted to believe the best about David." I thought about all the times over the years when David had asked for money for various reasons. The down payment assistance when he and Jessica bought their house. The loan for his car when he claimed his credit was temporarily damaged by an identity theft incident. The emergency fund he'd needed when Jessica had what he'd described as complications from a minor surgery that weren't covered by insurance. Looking back with new eyes, I could see a pattern of financial requests that had always been accompanied by emotional manipulation and just enough crisis to make me feel like I had no choice but to help. Each time, David had been grateful and apologetic, promising to pay me back and expressing guilt about having to ask. Each time, repayment had been delayed by new circumstances, and eventually, the debts had been quietly forgotten. "Linda," I said, "I think you're right. I think I've been enabling this behavior for years without recognizing what was happening. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Sarah, these people have been stealing from you. This isn't just a family disagreement about money. This is criminal behavior that needs to have consequences." I knew Linda was right, but the thought of pursuing criminal charges against my own son felt impossible. Despite everything I'd discovered, despite the evidence of systematic theft and deception, David was still my child. The idea of putting him in jail seemed like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about maternal love and family loyalty. But as I lay in my hotel bed that night, staring at the ceiling and processing everything that had happened, I realized something important. David and Jessica had already betrayed every principle of family loyalty. They had used my love for them as a vulnerability to exploit. They had stolen from me, lied to me, and manipulated their own children to facilitate their deception. My misplaced loyalty to them was actually a betrayal of myself and of the other potential victims they might target in the future. If I didn't hold them accountable for their actions, I would be enabling them to continue hurting people who trusted them. The next morning, I called Bob Hayes and told him to compile everything he'd found into a comprehensive report. I also called my attorney, Patricia Wells, and asked her to review my legal options for both civil and criminal action. "Sarah," Patricia said when we met in her office the following day, "the evidence Bob has gathered is extremely compelling. You have grounds for criminal charges of fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. You also have civil remedies for recovery of the stolen money and potentially punitive damages. What would criminal charges mean for David and Jessica?" Patricia's expression was serious. Depending on the total amount involved and the specific charges, they could be facing significant prison time. Elder financial abuse is taken very seriously by prosecutors, especially when it involves the systematic targeting of a vulnerable senior citizen by family members. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. "Patricia, I never wanted it to come to this. I just wanted to help my family." "I know, Sarah, but you need to understand that David and Jessica made their choices when they decided to steal from you. You're not responsible for the consequences of their criminal behavior. Your only responsibility is to protect yourself and prevent them from victimizing others." As I drove back to my hotel, I made a decision that felt both heartbreaking and liberating. I was going to hold my son and daughter-in-law accountable for what they'd done to me. Not out of revenge or anger, but out of respect for myself and recognition that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling. But before I took any legal action, I was going to give David one last chance to tell me the truth and make things right. I owed that much to the mother I'd been, even if I was no longer sure I owed anything to the son he'd become. I called David and asked him to meet me for lunch, alone, so we could have an honest conversation about our relationship and the loan situation. He agreed, though I could hear reluctance in his voice, and we arranged to meet at a quiet restaurant in Newport Beach the following day. As I prepared for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life, I realized that regardless of how it went, my relationship with David would never be the same. The son I'd thought I knew, the loving family man I'd been so proud of, had revealed himself to be someone entirely different. The question now was whether the real David was someone I could continue to have in my life, and whether he was capable of the honesty and accountability that would be required for any kind of relationship moving forward. I suspected I already knew the answer, but I was going to give him every opportunity to prove me wrong. The restaurant David had chosen was an upscale bistro overlooking Newport Harbor, the kind of place where entrees started at $30 and the wine list ran to multiple pages. As I sat at our reserved table watching boats drift by in the marina, I couldn't help but notice that this wasn't the choice of someone carefully managing expenses during a financial crisis. David arrived 15 minutes late, looking harried, and checking his phone constantly. He was dressed in what appeared to be a new suit, and I noticed his watch was different from the one Tom had given him for his college graduation, replaced by something that looked considerably more expensive. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek perfunctorily before settling into his chair. Traffic was insane, and I had a client call that ran longer than expected. "No problem, sweetheart," I said, studying his face and wondering how I'd missed the signs of deception that now seemed so obvious. "I appreciate you making time to meet with me." We ordered drinks and made small talk about the weather and his work, while I gathered my courage for the conversation I knew needed to happen. David seemed nervous, fidgeting with his napkin and glancing around the restaurant as if he were worried about being overheard. "David," I finally said, "I need to talk to you about the loan and about what's been happening with our family lately." His expression immediately became guarded. "What do you mean, Mom? Everything's going fine. Jessica's still working through the licensing situation, but we're managing." I took a deep breath and decided to start with what I hoped might be the least damaging revelation. "David, I know Jessica hasn't had any problems with her real estate license. I've seen public records showing she's been actively working and earning commissions throughout the time you told me she couldn't work." The color drained from David's face, but he recovered quickly, his expression shifting to what I could only describe as practiced innocence. "Mom, I think there might be some confusion. Jessica did have issues with the state board, but they were resolved more quickly than we expected. We've been meaning to call you and update you, but things have been so hectic with her trying to catch up on missed opportunities." The lie came so smoothly that I realized this was probably not the first time he'd been forced to explain away inconsistencies in his story. I felt a chill as I recognized the careful way he was constructing his explanation, leaving himself room to maneuver if I pressed for more details. "David, the records show her license was never suspended or under investigation. There was no state board issue. You lied to me about the entire reason you needed the money." For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Then he leaned forward, his voice taking on a wounded tone. "Mom, I can't believe you're checking up on us like we're criminals. We came to you for help during a difficult time, and now you're treating us like we're trying to scam you." The deflection was immediate and expertly executed. Instead of addressing the lie I'd caught him in, he'd made me the problem for discovering it. I felt the familiar maternal instinct to apologize and smooth things over, but I forced myself to stay. focused on what I knew to be true. David, I'm not treating you like criminals. I'm asking for honesty about how my money has been used. I've seen your new Mercedes, your new furniture, your obviously upgraded lifestyle. If you didn't need the money for the reasons you told me, I deserve to know what it was actually used for. David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I saw a flash of anger that he quickly suppressed. Mom, Jessica and I are adults. We're managing our finances responsibly, and we resent being interrogated about every purchase we make. The fact that we've been able to stabilize our situation faster than expected should be good news, not cause for suspicion. But David, you haven't made any payments on the loan, not even a token payment to show good faith. And you haven't communicated with me about when you might start repayments. We've been focused on getting back on our feet, he said, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. We told you it would take time, and we meant it. But we never said we weren't going to pay you back. The conversation continued for another hour, with David deflecting every question and turning each concern back on me. I was being paranoid. I was treating them unfairly. I was damaging our family relationship by questioning their integrity. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I could see how effective it had probably been in the past when I'd been more trusting and less prepared for his tactics. But what disturbed me most was the realization that David seemed to genuinely believe his own version of events. He wasn't just lying to me. He was lying to himself, constructing a narrative where he was the victim of my unreasonable suspicions rather than the perpetrator of a systematic deception. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, David made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Mom, I think we need to take a step back and remember what's really important here. Jessica and I love you, and the kids adore their grandmother. But if you keep treating us like we're dishonest, it's going to damage our relationship permanently. Is that really what you want? The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Behave or lose access to your grandchildren. Stop asking questions, or we'll cut you out of our lives entirely. It was emotional blackmail wrapped in expressions of love and concern for family harmony. I looked at my son across the table, this man I'd raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally for 42 years, and realized that I didn't know him at all. The person sitting across from me was a stranger who happened to share my DNA, someone who was capable of stealing from his own mother, and then making her feel guilty for discovering the theft. David, I said quietly, I think we both need some time to think about what we want from this relationship going forward. I love you, but I can't continue to pretend that everything is normal when I know it isn't. As I drove back to my hotel, I felt a strange sense of clarity settling over me. The son I'd thought I was protecting was gone, if he'd ever existed at all. The man I'd just had lunch with was someone who saw me as a resource to be managed, rather than a person to be loved and respected. That evening, I called Patricia Wells and told her to proceed with legal action to recover my money. I also called Bob Hayes and asked him to compile a complete report for the district attorney's office. Mrs. Mitchell, Bob said, I need to warn you that once we involve law enforcement, this situation is going to escalate quickly. Are you prepared for the possibility that David and Jessica might retaliate? What kind of retaliation are you thinking about? They might try to turn your grandchildren against you. They might spread false stories about your mental competency, or claim that you're making these accusations because of age-related confusion. People facing serious criminal charges often become desperate and unpredictable. I thought about Lily and Mason, who had no idea their parents were criminals and who would undoubtedly be caught in the middle of whatever was about to happen. The thought of losing my relationship with them was devastating, but I also realized that staying silent wouldn't protect them. It would only enable David and Jessica to continue their criminal behavior, potentially putting the children at risk, in ways I couldn't even imagine. Mr. Hayes, I understand the risks, but I also understand that if I don't hold them accountable, they'll continue to hurt people. I can't live with that. The next few days passed in a blur of legal meetings and document preparation. Patricia Wells worked with the district attorney's office to file criminal charges, while I met with victim services advocates who helped me understand what to expect as the case moved forward. The charges were extensive: elder abuse, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Based on the evidence Bob had gathered, David and Jessica had stolen over $40,000 directly from my accounts, in addition to the $95,000 loan they'd obtained under false pretenses. But even as I moved forward with legal action, I couldn't shake the feeling that David and Jessica weren't going to accept accountability quietly. They'd spent months carefully constructing lies and manipulating situations to their advantage. They weren't going to suddenly develop integrity just because they'd been caught. My instincts proved correct when Patricia called me on a Thursday afternoon with disturbing news. "Sarah, I just received a call from the Orange County Department of Social Services. Someone has filed a report claiming that you've been exhibiting signs of dementia and may be making false accusations against family members due to cognitive decline." My blood ran cold. Who filed the report? The report came from Jessica, who claimed to be concerned about your welfare after you made what she described as wild accusations about financial impropriety. She told the social worker that you've been increasingly confused and paranoid, and she's worried that someone might be taking advantage of your alleged mental decline to turn you against your own family. The audacity of it was breathtaking. David and Jessica were trying to use my age against me, claiming that my accusations of their criminal behavior were actually evidence of my own mental incompetency. They were trying to flip the script and make themselves appear to be the concerned family members protecting an elderly relative from her own confused accusations. "What does this mean for the criminal case?" I asked. "It complicates things," Patricia admitted. "If there's any question about your mental competency, the prosecutor might be reluctant to move forward. We need to address this immediately and definitively." Patricia arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Rebecca Chen, a specialist in cognitive assessment for elderly adults. The testing took the better part of a day and covered everything from memory and reasoning to emotional stability and judgment. The results were unambiguous. I was functioning at the high end of normal for my age group, with no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or impaired judgment. Dr. Chen's report specifically noted that my decision-making appeared sound, and that my account of recent events was consistent and detailed in a way that would be impossible for someone experiencing cognitive problems. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Chen said as she reviewed the results with me, "you're sharper than many people half your age. Whatever family dynamics you're dealing with, they have nothing to do with any cognitive decline on your part." Armed with Dr. Chen's report, Patricia was able to quickly dismiss the social services investigation. But the fact that David and Jessica had tried to have me declared mentally incompetent revealed a level of calculated cruelty that went beyond simple greed. They weren't just stealing from me. They were trying to destroy my credibility and reputation, to protect themselves from the consequences of their crimes. They were willing to have me declared mentally unfit if it served their purposes, regardless of how that might affect my independence or my relationships with other people. The realization that my son was capable of such systematic cruelty was almost harder to process than the financial theft. Money could be recovered, credit could be repaired, but the knowledge that David saw me as an obstacle to be neutralized rather than a person to be protected was devastating in a way that felt irreparable. But David and Jessica's attacks on my mental competency were just the beginning of their retaliation campaign. Their next move would target the relationship I cherished most, and it would force me to make a choice between protecting myself and protecting my grandchildren. The call came on a Saturday morning while I was having breakfast in my hotel room. An unknown number with a local area code appeared on my phone, and when I answered, I heard a young voice I recognized immediately. "Grandma Sarah? It's Mason. Mommy said I could call you." My heart leaped at the sound of my grandson's voice, but something in his tone made me immediately cautious. Mason, sweetheart, it's so good to hear from you. How are you doing? I'm okay, but Grandma Sarah, I need to ask you something. Mommy and Daddy said you've been saying mean things about them and that you don't want to be our grandma anymore. Is that true? The question hit me like a physical blow. David and Jessica were using their 7-year-old son to deliver their emotional manipulation, coaching him to ask questions designed to make me feel guilty for pursuing legal action against them. Mason, honey, I love you and Lily more than anything in the world. I will always want to be your grandma, no matter what happens with your mommy and daddy. But why are you being mean to them? Daddy was crying last night and Mommy said it's because you're trying to hurt our family. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, coaching Mason on what to say next. The realization that they were using their children as weapons in their campaign against me was sickening. Mason, sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about important things. But those disagreements are never your fault, and they don't change how much I love you. Before Mason could respond, I heard Jessica take the phone. Sarah, I hope you're satisfied. The children are terrified that they're going to lose their grandmother because of your vindictive behavior. Jessica, you and David created this situation when you decided to steal from me. Don't blame me for the consequences of your choices. We never stole anything from you, Jessica said, her voice cold and controlled. We borrowed money from family during a difficult time, and now you're trying to destroy us because we haven't paid it back as quickly as you wanted. The children don't understand why their grandmother has turned against their parents. The conversation that followed was one of the most disturbing I'd ever experienced. Jessica systematically denied every fact I'd discovered, claiming that my evidence was either fabricated or misinterpreted. She painted herself and David as victims of my unreasonable demands and vindictive behavior. And she made it clear that my relationship with Lily and Mason would be contingent on my dropping all legal action against them. The children miss you, Jessica said, but we can't allow them to be around someone who's actively trying to harm their family. If you continue with these false accusations and legal threats, we'll have no choice but to protect them from your toxic behavior. After she hung up, I sat in my hotel room shaking with rage and heartbreak. David and Jessica had crossed a line that felt unforgivable. Using their children to manipulate me was bad enough, but threatening to cut off my access to Lily and Mason unless I allowed them to continue stealing from me was a form of emotional terrorism. I called Linda in Portland and told her what had happened. My sister's response was immediate and fierce. Sarah, they're using those children as hostages. This is exactly what abusers do when they're backed into a corner. They escalate their tactics and target whatever you care about most. But Linda, what if I never see Lily and Mason again? What if pursuing this case costs me my grandchildren? Sarah, listen to me carefully. If you give in to this blackmail, you're teaching David and Jessica that threatening your relationship with the children is an effective way to control you. They'll use this tactic every time they want something from you for the rest of your life. Linda's words stung because I knew she was right. If I backed down now, David and Jessica would know they could manipulate me indefinitely by threatening my access to my grandchildren. They would continue stealing from me, lying to me, and using my love for Lily and Mason as a weapon against me. But the thought of losing my grandchildren felt like losing Tom all over again. They were the brightest lights in my life, the reason I got up in the morning and the source of my greatest joy. The idea of them growing up thinking their grandmother had abandoned them or turned against their family was unbearable. That evening, as I struggled with the impossible choice between protecting myself and protecting my relationship with my grandchildren, I received a call that would change everything. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Detective Maria Santos with the Orange County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about the criminal charges that have been filed against David and Jessica Mitchell. Yes, Detective. What can I do for you? Mrs. Mitchell, based on our investigation of your case, we've discovered evidence that your son and daughter-in-law may have been involved in similar schemes targeting other elderly victims. We'd like to meet with you to discuss what you've discovered and get your cooperation with a broader investigation. The scope of what Detective Santos revealed in our meeting the next day was staggering. David and Jessica weren't just opportunistic thieves who had decided to steal from one elderly relative. They were part of what appeared to be a systematic pattern of elder abuse that had targeted multiple victims over several years. The investigation had uncovered evidence that they'd used similar tactics against Jessica's elderly aunt in Sacramento, claiming they needed money for medical expenses that never existed. They'd borrowed $15,000 from David's former boss, claiming they needed help with Lily's educational expenses, and had never made any attempt at repayment. They'd even convinced their elderly neighbor to invest in a business venture that was completely fictional. "Mrs. Mitchell," Detective Santos said, "what happened to you wasn't personal. You weren't targeted because of any weakness or vulnerability. You were targeted because you fit the profile of their preferred victims: elderly, financially stable, and emotionally invested in family relationships." The detective's words were both devastating and liberating. Devastating because they confirmed that my son was a predator who had spent years systematically targeting vulnerable people. Liberating because they made it clear that I wasn't responsible for what had happened to me. "Detective, what happens to my grandchildren if David and Jessica are arrested?" "That would be handled by the Department of Children and Family Services. They would look for suitable relatives to provide temporary care while the case is resolved." I thought about Lily and Mason, innocent children who would soon discover that their parents were criminals. They would need stability, love, and protection from the chaos that was about to engulf their lives. "Detective Santos, I want to do whatever I can to help with your investigation, and I want to make sure my grandchildren are protected throughout this process." As I left the sheriff's office that afternoon, I realized that my decision had been made for me. This wasn't about choosing between my financial security and my relationship with my grandchildren. This was about protecting Lily and Mason from parents who were capable of using them as weapons and shields in their criminal activities. David and Jessica had made their choice when they decided to steal from me and then use their children to try to escape the consequences. Now I was going to make mine. The next phase of this battle was about to begin, and I was no longer going to fight it as a heartbroken mother trying to preserve family relationships. I was going to fight it as a victim of elder abuse who refused to be silenced, and as a grandmother, determined to protect her grandchildren from parents who had proven they couldn't be trusted with anyone's well-being, including their own children's. The Mother's Day confrontation that would give this story its ending was still 2 weeks away, but the foundation for that moment was being laid with every legal document filed, every piece of evidence gathered, and every ally recruited to help me take my life back from people who had tried to steal far more than just my money. David had taught me exactly what kind of mother he thought I had been, and I was about to teach him exactly what kind of mother I was capable of becoming when my family was threatened. The arrests happened on a Thursday morning in early May, just 2 weeks before Mother's Day. Detective Santos called me at 6 a.m. to let me know that David and Jessica had been taken into custody at their Newport Beach home as they prepared to leave for what appeared to be a hastily planned vacation to Mexico. "Mrs. Mitchell, we found packed suitcases, airline tickets for the entire family departing this afternoon, and approximately $28,000 in cash hidden in a safe in their bedroom," Detective Santos told me. "It looks like they were planning to disappear before the criminal charges could be formally filed." My hands shook as I processed this information. David and Jessica had been preparing to take my grandchildren and flee the country, presumably to avoid prosecution for their crimes. The thought of Lily and Mason being dragged into a life as fugitives, torn away from everything familiar and stable, made me feel physically sick. "What about the children, Detective? Where are they now?" "They're safe. Child Protective Services has temporary custody, and they're working to place them with suitable family members while this case is resolved. Mrs. Mitchell, I believe you're listed as their closest relative after the parents." The next few hours were a whirlwind of phone calls, legal meetings, and emergency custody arrangements. Linda drove down from Portland immediately, and together we navigated the complex process of becoming temporary guardians for Lily and Mason, while their parents sat in county jail awaiting trial. When I first saw my grandchildren in the sterile conference room at the Department of Children and Family Services, my heart broke for them. Lily, now 10 years old, was trying to be brave for her younger brother, but I could see the confusion and fear in her eyes. Mason clung to his sister's hand and wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. "Grandma Sarah," Lily said in a small voice when she saw me. "They said Mommy and Daddy can't come home for a while. Did we do something wrong?" I knelt down to their level and pulled them both into my arms, fighting back tears. "Oh, sweetheart, you and Mason didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes grown-ups make very bad choices, and when that happens, there have to be consequences. But you are safe and you are loved, and Linda and I are going to take care of you." Mason finally looked up at me with Tom's brown eyes. "Are you really our grandma? Mommy said you didn't want to be our family anymore." The pain of hearing how David and Jessica had poisoned my grandchildren against me was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to stay calm and reassuring. "Mason, I will always be your grandma, no matter what happens. I love you and Lily more than all the stars in the sky, and nothing will ever change that." The process of gaining temporary custody took 3 days of legal proceedings, psychological evaluations, and home inspections. Linda had found us a furnished rental house in Costa Mesa, halfway between my Riverside townhouse and the children's school in Newport Beach, so Lily and Mason could maintain some stability in their education while their world was turned upside down. During those first weeks together, I watched my grandchildren struggle to process what had happened to their family. Lily threw herself into her schoolwork with an intensity that worried me, as if academic achievement could somehow fix the chaos in her life. Mason became withdrawn and had nightmares about being abandoned, waking up several times each night to make sure Linda and I were still there. The court-appointed therapist, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, helped all of us navigate this difficult transition. She explained to Lily and Mason in age-appropriate terms that their parents had made choices that hurt other people, including me, and that those choices had consequences. She helped them understand that loving their parents didn't mean approving of their actions, and that being angry about what had happened was normal and healthy. Children often blame themselves when their family structure changes dramatically. Dr. Rodriguez explained to me during one of our sessions, "Lily and Mason need consistent reassurance that none of this is their fault, and they need to see that the adults in their lives now are trustworthy and stable." Establishing that trust took time. Both children had been living in a household where lies were normal, where adults said one thing and did another, where love was conditional on behavior and circumstances. They tested Linda and me constantly in those first weeks, pushing boundaries, and waiting for us to abandon them or reveal ourselves to be just as unreliable as their parents had proven to be. But gradually, as we maintained consistent routines, kept our promises, and showed them unconditional love regardless of their behavior, they began to relax into their new reality. Lily started bringing me her artwork again, proud drawings and paintings that she wanted to share. Mason began telling me about his soccer games and asking me to help him practice kicks in the backyard. The criminal trial began in September, and the media attention was intense. David and Jessica's arrest had uncovered what prosecutors described as one of the most systematic elder abuse schemes ever prosecuted in Orange County. The evidence Bob Hayes had gathered, combined with the detective work of law enforcement, revealed that they had stolen over $300,000 from elderly victims over a 4-year period. I testified for 2 days, walking the jury through the timeline of deception, the fabricated crisis about Jessica's real estate license, the unauthorized use of my credit cards, and the threats and manipulation that had followed my discovery of their crimes. It was emotionally exhausting, but I felt a sense of purpose in telling my story. Every word I spoke was a step toward justice for myself and for the other elderly victims who had trusted David and Jessica with their financial security. The most difficult part of my testimony came when the prosecutor asked me to describe the impact of David and Jessica's actions on my relationship with my grandchildren. They used my love for Lily and Mason as a weapon against me, I told the jury, my voice steady despite the tears I was fighting back. They threatened to cut off my access to my grandchildren if I didn't stop pursuing legal action against them. They were willing to destroy a child's relationship with their grandmother to protect themselves from the consequences of their crimes. David sat at the defense table throughout my testimony, rarely making eye contact with me. When he did look in my direction, I saw no remorse, no recognition of the pain he had caused. He looked like a man who felt wronged by the system, not like someone who understood the gravity of what he had done to his own mother. Jessica was more emotional, crying frequently and shaking her head as if she couldn't believe she was in this situation. But her tears felt performative to me, designed to garner sympathy from the jury rather than expressing genuine remorse for her actions. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. Jessica received 10 years for her role in the scheme. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to their victims, though the prosecutor acknowledged that most of the stolen money would likely never be recovered. As I listened to the judge deliver the sentences, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, sadness that it had come to this, and uncertainty about how to explain to Lily and Mason that their parents would be in prison for most of their childhood. But underneath all those feelings was something else, a sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt in years. I had stood up for myself against people who had tried to exploit my love and generosity. I had protected other potential victims from David and Jessica's manipulation. And most importantly, I had created a safe, stable environment for my grandchildren to grow up in, free from the toxic dynamics that had characterized their early years. The weeks following the sentencing were emotionally challenging for all of us. Lily and Mason had to process the reality that their parents would be absent from their lives for years to come. They went through periods of anger, sadness, and confusion as they worked with Dr. Rodriguez to understand and accept their new circumstances. But there were also moments of unexpected joy and healing. Halloween that year was the first holiday we celebrated as our new family unit. Lily dressed as an artist, complete with a paint-splattered smock and a palette she had made herself. Mason chose to be a soccer player, wearing a jersey from his favorite professional team. As we walked through the neighborhood's trick-or-treating, I watched them laugh and run with other children, and I realized that despite everything they had been through, they were resilient and capable of happiness. Thanksgiving was more challenging. It was impossible to ignore the empty chairs where David and Jessica should have been sitting. But Linda had flown down from Portland, and we had invited Maggie Thompson and 2 other friends from my Riverside community to join us. As we went, around the table sharing what we were grateful for, Lily surprised me by saying she was thankful for Grandma Sarah and Aunt Linda, who love us no matter what. Mason added that he was grateful for his new bedroom and for the fact that nobody yells about money anymore. Those simple statements from my grandchildren revealed how much their home environment had improved since leaving their parents' house. They were living with adults who didn't fight about finances, who didn't lie about their circumstances, who didn't use them as emotional weapons in adult conflicts. For the first time in their young lives, they were experiencing what stable, healthy family relationships looked like. As winter turned to spring and we approached the first anniversary of my discovery of David and Jessica's crimes, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed. A year earlier, I had been a naive grandmother who believed that family meant unconditional acceptance of any behavior, no matter how destructive. I had confused enabling with love, and I had allowed myself to be exploited because I was afraid that setting boundaries would damage my relationships. Now I understood that real love required accountability, that healthy relationships were built on mutual respect rather than manipulation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. The house in Costa Mesa had become a real home for the three of us. Linda had decided to stay in California permanently, selling her Portland house and establishing herself as a full-time co-guardian for Lily and Mason. She had found work as a consulting nurse for several medical practices in the area, and she brought a wonderful balance of practicality and warmth to our household. Lily was thriving in school and had joined the advanced art program, where her teachers consistently praised her creativity and technical skill. She had also made several close friends, something that had been difficult for her when she was constantly worried about her parents' financial stress and unpredictable moods. Mason had grown more confident and outgoing, joining a competitive soccer league and excelling both athletically and socially. His nightmares had stopped, and he was sleeping through the night consistently for the first time since coming to live with us. Both children were doing well in therapy, and Dr. Rodriguez had gradually reduced their sessions from weekly to monthly, as they demonstrated increased emotional stability and resilience. But the real test of our new family dynamic was approaching: Mother's Day, exactly 1 year after the phone call that had started this entire ordeal. I had been dreading the holiday, knowing that it would inevitably bring up complicated emotions for all of us. Lily and Mason would be thinking about Jessica, despite everything that had happened. I would be remembering the naive woman I had been a year earlier, so eager to help what I thought was my struggling family. The week before Mother's Day, Lily approached me with a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma Sarah, can we visit Mommy on Mother's Day? I know she did bad things, but she's still our mom." The request broke my heart and filled me with anxiety in equal measure. I had been dreading the moment when Lily and Mason would want to reconnect with their parents, knowing that David and Jessica would likely use any contact as an opportunity to manipulate the children and undermine the stability Linda and I had worked so hard to create. But I also knew that forbidding contact completely might backfire, creating resentment and making David and Jessica seem like forbidden fruit that was even more appealing because it was denied. "Lily, sweetheart, that's a very important question, and I want to give you a thoughtful answer. Can we talk about it with Aunt Linda and Dr. Rodriguez before we decide?" The family meeting we held that evening was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever participated in. Dr. Rodriguez helped us explore the children's feelings about their parents, their motivations for wanting contact, and their understanding of the boundaries that would need to be in place. "I miss Mommy," Mason admitted during the discussion, "but I don't want to live with her again. I like living here where nobody gets mad about bills." Lily was more conflicted. "I love Mommy and Daddy, but I'm also mad at them for lying to Grandma Sarah and for making us scared all the time. I want to see them, but I don't want them to try to take us away from here." Dr. Rodriguez helped us establish clear parameters for a potential visit. It would be supervised, limited to 1 hour, and focused on allowing the children to express their feelings to their parents rather than on rebuilding a relationship that might not be healthy for anyone involved. The visit was scheduled for the Saturday before Mother's Day at the county jail's family visiting room. Linda and I would be present throughout, and Dr. Rodriguez would be available immediately afterward to help the children process whatever emotions came up. As we drove to the jail that Saturday morning, I felt my stomach churning with anxiety. I hadn't seen David since his sentencing 6 months earlier, and I had no idea what to expect from this encounter. Would he be angry and hostile? Would he try to manipulate Lily and Mason? Would he blame me for the destruction of his family? The visiting room was a sterile, institutional space with plastic tables and chairs bolted to the floor. When David and Jessica were brought in, wearing orange jail uniforms and looking older and more worn than I remembered, I felt a pang of sadness for the family we might have been if they had made different choices. But that sadness quickly gave way to wariness as I watched David's face when he saw the children. There was love there, genuine affection for Lily and Mason, but there was also something calculating in his expression that made me immediately alert. "Lily, Mason," David said, kneeling down to hug his children. "I've missed you both so much. Are you taking good care of each other?" The children hugged their father, but I could see they were more reserved than they had been in the past. Living in a stable environment had given them a new perspective on their parents' behavior, and they seemed to sense that something was different about this interaction. "Daddy," Lily said carefully, "why did you take Grandma Sarah's money without asking?" The question clearly caught David off guard. He glanced at me with an expression that mixed hurt and accusation, as if I had coached Lily to ask it. "Sweetheart, that's very complicated," David said. "Sometimes adults have disagreements about money, and sometimes those disagreements get blown out of proportion." "But Dr. Rodriguez said you took money that wasn't yours," Mason added. "She said that's called stealing." Jessica jumped in, her voice taking on the same manipulative tone I remembered from our phone conversations. "Mason, honey, Grandma Sarah was angry with us about some grown-up things, and she said some things that weren't true. We never meant to hurt anyone." I watched as my grandchildren processed their parents' words, and I could see them struggling with the contradiction between what they had been told by their therapist and what their parents were now claiming. "Mommy," Lily said slowly, "if you didn't do anything wrong, why are you in jail?" The hour that followed was painful for everyone involved. David and Jessica alternated between expressing love for their children and subtly trying to undermine the narrative that had led to their imprisonment. They didn't explicitly deny their crimes, but they consistently minimized their actions and implied that they were victims of a vindictive legal system and an unreasonable grandmother. But Lily and Mason were no longer the confused, scared children they had been a year earlier. Living in a household where adults told the truth, kept their promises, and treated each other with respect had given them a framework for recognizing manipulation when they saw it. When David suggested that they might be able to come home soon if Grandma Sarah would just tell the truth about what really happened, Lily looked directly at him and said, "Daddy, Dr. Rodriguez says that people who do bad things have to accept consequences. She says that's how we learn to make better choices." The visit ended with emotional goodbyes, but I could see that both children were troubled by the encounter. David and Jessica had tried to plant seeds of doubt about the reality of their situation, and Lily and Mason were struggling to reconcile their love for their parents with their understanding of right and wrong. On the drive home, Mason asked the question I had been dreading. "Grandma Sarah, are Mommy and Daddy ever going to come home?" I took a deep breath before answering. "Mason, your parents will get out of jail someday, but that won't be for several years. And when they do, they'll have to prove that they've learned from their mistakes and that they can make better choices before they can be part of your daily lives again." "Will we have to go live with them?" Lily asked, and I could hear the anxiety in her voice. "Not unless you want to, and not unless a judge believes it would be safe and healthy for you," I said. "Aunt Linda and I will always be here for you, no matter what happens with your parents." That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Lily surprised me with an announcement. "Grandma Sarah, I want to make Mother's Day special for you tomorrow. Not because you're our real mom, but because you're the one who takes care of us now." Mason nodded enthusiastically. "Can we make you breakfast in bed? And maybe give you some flowers?" The sweetness of their gesture brought tears to my eyes. These children, who had been through so much trauma and loss, were choosing to celebrate the relationship we had built together, rather than mourning the relationships that had been damaged by their parents' choices. Mother's Day morning dawned, bright and clear. Linda and I were awakened by the sound of whispering and giggling from the kitchen, followed by the smell of bacon and something that might have been pancakes burning slightly on the stove. When Lily and Mason appeared in my bedroom doorway, carrying a tray laden with breakfast and a small bouquet of flowers they had picked from our garden, I felt my heart fill with a joy I hadn't experienced in years. "Happy Mother's Day, Grandma Sarah," Lily said solemnly. Thank you for being the kind of mom who tells the truth and keeps us safe. As I sat in bed eating slightly burnt pancakes and perfectly cooked bacon while my grandchildren chattered about their plans for the day, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year ago, David had delivered the devastating words that would ultimately change all our lives. "You were never really a mother to me." He had meant those words as a weapon, designed to hurt me and make me question my worth as a parent and a person. But in the end, his cruel assessment had been a gift. Because he was right, I hadn't been the kind of mother he needed. I had been an enabler who confused love with permissiveness, who sacrificed my own well-being to avoid conflict, who taught him through my actions that love meant never holding people accountable for their choices. The mother I had been to David had failed him by not teaching him boundaries, consequences, or respect for others. She had created a man who believed he was entitled to other people's resources without earning them, who thought family relationships were transactional rather than reciprocal. But the woman I had become through this ordeal was a different kind of mother entirely. I was the kind of mother who protected her family by standing up to people who tried to harm them, even when those people shared her DNA. I was the kind of mother who chose truth over comfort, accountability over peace, justice over family harmony. Most importantly, I was the kind of mother who understood that real love sometimes required saying no, setting boundaries, and allowing people to face the consequences of their actions. As Lily and Mason finished their breakfast and began planning our Mother's Day activities, I realized that David had been absolutely correct in his assessment. I had never really been a mother to him in the way he needed, but I had learned to be the kind of mother Lily and Mason deserved, and the kind of mother I should have been all along. And that transformation from victim to victor, from enabler to protector, from a woman who accepted mistreatment in the name of family loyalty to a woman who demanded respect and honesty in all her relationships, was the real Mother's Day gift. David had told me I was never really a mother to him, so I had proved him right by becoming the mother his children needed instead. That Mother's Day afternoon, as we cleaned up the breakfast dishes and planned our day together, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been just 12 months earlier. She felt like a stranger to me now, that version of myself who had been so desperate for approval and acceptance that she would sacrifice her financial security and personal dignity to maintain relationships that were fundamentally toxic. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of awakening, like emerging from a deep sleep where I had spent decades dreaming I was living one life while actually existing in something completely different. The woman who had liquidated her retirement savings without question, who had accepted excuses and delays without complaint, who had allowed herself to be manipulated through guilt and false crises. That woman had died somewhere on a highway, between discovering David's lies and deciding to fight back. In her place stood someone I was still getting to know. A woman who understood that love without respect was just exploitation wearing a prettier mask. Someone who recognized that family obligations were supposed to flow both ways, not just from the older generation to the younger. A person who had learned that saying no to unreasonable demands wasn't selfish, it was self-preservation. As Lily and Mason argued good-naturedly about whether we should spend the afternoon at the beach or visiting the art museum, I marveled at how different our family dynamics were from what they had experienced in their parents' household. Here, disagreements were resolved through discussion rather than manipulation. Decisions were made based on what would make everyone happy rather than what would serve one person's agenda. Love was expressed through actions that built people up rather than words designed to tear them down. The children had been in our care for nearly a year now, and the changes in their personalities and behavior were remarkable. Lily no longer carried the weight of the world on her 10-year-old shoulders, no longer felt responsible for managing adult emotions or keeping family secrets. Her artwork had evolved from dark, anxious scribbles to vibrant paintings full of color and hope. She laughed more easily, asked for help when she needed it, and had developed friendships with children who valued her for who she was rather than what she could provide. Mason had transformed from a withdrawn, fearful child into an energetic boy who approached life with enthusiasm and confidence. His soccer skills had improved dramatically once he stopped worrying about disappointing adults or being a financial burden on his family. He slept peacefully through the night, spoke up for himself when he disagreed with something, and had learned to trust that the adults in his life would keep their promises. Both children were excelling academically, but more importantly, they were learning what healthy relationships looked like. They were discovering that adults could disagree without screaming, that financial stress didn't have to dominate family conversations, that love could be expressed through consistency and reliability rather than grand gestures followed by betrayal. The court-appointed child psychologist, Dr. Rodriguez, had been amazed by their progress during our monthly check-ins. "Children are incredibly resilient," she had told me during our most recent session, "but they need stable, trustworthy adults to help them heal from trauma. You and Linda have provided exactly the kind of environment these children needed to process their experiences and develop healthy coping mechanisms." The legal proceedings had concluded 6 months earlier with David and Jessica's sentencing, but the emotional work of healing from their betrayal continued. I had my own therapist now, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in helping elderly adults recover from family financial abuse. Through our sessions, I had begun to understand the psychological patterns that had made me vulnerable to David and Jessica's manipulation. "You were conditioned from childhood to believe that your worth was tied to your usefulness to others," Dr. Chen had explained during one of our early sessions. That kind of conditioning makes people particularly vulnerable to exploitation by family members who understand how to trigger guilt and obligation. The insight had been both painful and liberating. Painful because it forced me to examine decades of relationships and interactions through a new lens, recognizing patterns of exploitation I had previously interpreted as normal family dynamics. Liberating because it helped me understand that my victimization hadn't been the result of personal weakness or naivety, but rather the predictable outcome of psychological conditioning that could be recognized and changed. Through therapy, I had learned to identify manipulation tactics, set appropriate boundaries, and respond to guilt-inducing behavior with clarity rather than compliance. I had developed what Dr. Chen called healthy skepticism, the ability to question people's motives and demands rather than automatically assuming they were legitimate. Most importantly, I had learned to differentiate between being needed and being used. David and Jessica had made me feel needed by creating artificial crises that only I could solve, but their neediness had been performative, designed to extract resources rather than build genuine connection. Lily and Mason needed me too, but their need was authentic, based on their genuine dependence on adult care and guidance rather than manufactured emergencies. The financial recovery had been more successful than I had initially hoped. The criminal restitution process had recovered approximately 60% of what David and Jessica had stolen, and the sale of their Newport Beach house had provided additional funds. Combined with the return of my original loan through asset seizure, I had actually emerged from the ordeal in better financial shape than I had been before David's initial phone call. But more importantly, I had restructured my financial planning to protect myself from future exploitation. I had worked with a fee-only financial planner to create a comprehensive estate plan that included safeguards against elder abuse, clear beneficiary designations that couldn't be manipulated, and ironclad legal protections for my assets. I had also established trust funds for Lily and Mason's education and future needs, ensuring that my grandchildren would benefit from my financial planning without creating opportunities for other family members to exploit those resources. The trusts were structured so that the children would receive funds directly when they reached appropriate ages, eliminating any possibility that their parents or other relatives could access the money for their own purposes. The house in Costa Mesa had become a real home for our unconventional family. Linda had officially relocated from Portland and had taken over the master bedroom, while I had claimed the smaller bedroom that overlooked the garden I had spent months cultivating. Lily and Mason each had their own rooms, decorated according to their individual interests and personalities, spaces that belonged to them completely without the threat of sudden moves or disruptions. We had established routines and traditions that gave structure and meaning to our daily lives. Sunday morning pancakes that Linda made from scratch while I prepared fresh fruit, and the children set the table. Wednesday evening art sessions where Lily taught the rest of us various drawing and painting techniques. Saturday afternoon soccer practice in the backyard, where Mason demonstrated the skills he was learning in his league while we cheered and offered encouragement. The neighborhood had embraced our family configuration without question or judgment. The retired couple next door, Harold and Margaret Evans, had become surrogate grandparents who helped with childcare emergencies and school pickup when Linda and I had conflicting appointments. The single mother across the street, Rosa Martinez, had formed a mutual support network with us, sharing babysitting duties and carpooling responsibilities. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged to a community rather than just existing in proximity to other people. The relationships I had built in Costa Mesa were based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation or manipulation. People valued my friendship for who I was rather than what I could provide, and I found myself able to offer help and support from a place of strength, rather than desperation for approval. The children's school had been remarkably supportive throughout the transition. Both Lily and Mason had been assigned counselors who helped them navigate the social challenges of explaining their family situation to classmates and teachers. The school administration had worked with us to ensure that David and Jessica couldn't access the children or their academic records, providing an additional layer of protection during the legal proceedings. Lily's art teacher, Mrs. Patricia Williams, had become a particularly important mentor. She had recognized Lily's talent and emotional intelligence, encouraging her to use art as a way of processing her experiences and expressing her feelings. Under Mrs. Williams' guidance, Lily had created a series of paintings that documented her journey from chaos to stability, visual narratives that showed her growing confidence and sense of security. Mason's soccer coach, Roberto Silva, had provided similar support by creating a team environment where Mason could experience success and belonging based on his own efforts rather than family circumstances. Coach Silva had also connected Mason with a youth mentorship program that paired him with a college student who served as a positive male role model during a time when his relationship with his father was so complicated. Both children had formed genuine friendships with peers who knew nothing about their parents' criminal activities and who valued them for their individual qualities. Lily had found a best friend in Emma Chen, a classmate who shared her love of art and reading. Mason had connected with a group of boys who played soccer together and supported each other through the normal challenges of childhood. These friendships had been crucial in helping the children develop identities separate from their family trauma. They were no longer defined by what had happened to them, but by who they were choosing to become. They had learned that they could trust other people, form meaningful connections, and expect to be treated with kindness and respect. The question of future contact with David and Jessica remained complicated and emotionally charged. The children expressed conflicted feelings about their parents, loving them despite understanding that their behavior had been harmful. Dr. Rodriguez had helped us develop a framework for potential future interactions that prioritized the children's emotional safety while acknowledging their need to maintain some connection to their biological parents. Any future contact would be supervised and structured around the children's needs rather than the parents' desires for reconciliation. David and Jessica would need to demonstrate genuine remorse, complete rehabilitation programs, and show sustained evidence of changed behavior before being allowed meaningful access to Lily and Mason's lives. More importantly, the children would have complete control over the timing and extent of any relationship with their parents. They would never be pressured to forgive or reconcile, and their decisions would be respected regardless of what other family members or social expectations might suggest was appropriate. The legal system had provided additional protections through restraining orders that prevented David and Jessica from contacting me directly or attempting to interfere with the children's care. These orders would remain in effect for several years beyond their prison sentences, ensuring that our family could continue healing without the threat of renewed manipulation or harassment. Linda had proven to be an ideal co-guardian and life partner in this unexpected chapter of our lives. Her nursing background had been invaluable in helping the children process their trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. Her practical nature balanced my more emotional approach to problem solving, and her sense of humor kept our household light and joyful, even during difficult moments. We had developed a partnership based on shared values and complementary strengths, rather than desperation or convenience. Linda handled most of the daily logistical challenges of raising 2 children, while I focused on emotional support and educational enrichment. We made major decisions together and presented a united front on discipline and expectations, giving Lily and Mason the consistency they had never experienced in their parents' household. Our relationship had also evolved beyond mere co-parenting into a genuine friendship and mutual support system. We enjoyed each other's company, shared similar interests in gardening and reading, and had developed inside jokes and traditions that made our daily interactions pleasant and comfortable. The financial arrangements had been structured to ensure fairness and sustainability for both of us. I had purchased the Costa Mesa house outright, eliminating mortgage payments that might have created stress. Linda contributed to household expenses through her nursing income, and we shared childcare costs and family activities equitably. Both of us had updated our estate plans to ensure that Lily and Mason would be provided for regardless of what happened to either of us in the future. As Mother's Day afternoon progressed and we settled on a compromise that included both beach time and a visit to the art museum, I found myself reflecting on the conversation I had avoided having with David during our last phone call before his arrest. He had asked me directly whether I cared more about money than family, framing the choice as if I had to pick between financial security and emotional relationships. At the time, his question had felt like an impossible dilemma. How could I choose between protecting myself and preserving connections with people I loved? The manipulation had been expertly crafted to make me feel selfish for wanting accountability, and cruel for setting boundaries. But I understood now that David's question had been based on a false premise. Real family relationships didn't require me to choose between financial security and emotional connection. Healthy family dynamics were built on mutual respect, honest communication, and reciprocal care rather than one-sided sacrifice and exploitation. The people who truly loved me, like Linda and my grandchildren, wanted me to be safe and secure. They valued my well-being alongside their own and would never ask me to compromise my stability for their convenience. They understood that protecting myself financially wasn't selfishness. It was responsible self-care that enabled me to be present and supportive for the people who mattered most. David and Jessica had framed their theft as a family obligation, claiming that my resources belonged to all of us and that my reluctance to share unconditionally was evidence of misplaced priorities. But their version of family was actually a pyramid scheme where resources flowed upward to support the lifestyles of people who had never learned to manage their own finances responsibly. The family I had built with Linda, Lily, and Mason operated on completely different principles. We shared resources based on genuine need and mutual benefit rather than manipulation and entitlement. We made financial decisions transparently and collaboratively rather than through deception and guilt. We understood that individual security contributed to collective well-being, rather than competing with it. As we drove to the beach that afternoon, listening to Mason explain the rules of a new soccer drill he had learned, and Lily describe her plans for a Mother's Day painting she wanted to create for me, I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like: comfortable, supportive, genuine, built on choice rather than obligation. The beach was crowded with other families celebrating Mother's Day, and I watched the various dynamics playing out around us with new eyes. I could see the difference between relationships based on authentic connection and those driven by duty or habit. I noticed which families seemed genuinely happy to be together and which appeared to be going through the motions of family activities. Lily and Mason ran into the waves with the unselfconscious joy of children who felt secure in their place in the world. They called for me to watch their sandcastle construction, invited Linda to help with their shell collecting, and negotiated their afternoon activities with the confidence of children who knew their voices would be heard and their preferences respected. As I sat on our beach blanket watching my grandchildren play, I thought about the letter I had received from David 2 weeks earlier. It had been forwarded through my attorney, since the restraining order prevented him from contacting me directly. In it, he had attempted what I supposed was meant to be an apology, though it read more like a justification for his behavior. He had written about the pressure he had felt to maintain a certain lifestyle, the gambling debts that had spiraled out of control, the shame that had prevented him from asking for help in more honest ways. He had claimed that he had never intended to hurt me, and that his actions had been motivated by desperation rather than malice. But nowhere in the letter had he acknowledged the systematic nature of his deception, the months of planning that had gone into manipulating me, or the cruelty of using his children as weapons against me. He had framed his crimes as mistakes, rather than choices, victims of circumstance rather than deliberate exploitation. Most tellingly, he had ended the letter by suggesting that we could rebuild our relationship if I would just find it in my heart to forgive him and help him convince the parole board that he had learned from his mistakes. Even from prison, even after everything that had happened, he was still trying to manipulate me into serving his interests. I had shown the letter to Dr. Chen, who had helped me understand it as a classic example of what she called strategic remorse. David wasn't genuinely sorry for the pain he had caused me. He was sorry that his actions had resulted in consequences for himself. His apology was designed to serve his future needs rather than acknowledge my past harm. Reading that letter had actually been helpful in my healing process because it had confirmed that the man I thought I knew had never really existed. The loving, grateful son I had imagined receiving my help had been a performance designed to facilitate theft. The real David was the person who could write that letter, who could continue to view our relationship in transactional terms, even after being sentenced to prison for stealing from me. Understanding this had freed me from the lingering guilt I had carried about pursuing criminal charges against my own son. I hadn't destroyed our family relationship. I had simply revealed that no genuine relationship had existed in the first place. David had never seen me as a person worthy of love and respect, only as a resource to be managed and exploited. The children had asked me several times over the past months whether I missed their father, and I had struggled to answer honestly without damaging their ability to maintain their own complicated feelings about him. How could I explain that I missed the person I had thought he was, but felt relief at being free from the person he actually was? Dr. Rodriguez had helped me find language that was truthful but age-appropriate. I told Lily and Mason that I was sad about the choices their father had made, but that I didn't miss being lied to or stolen from. I explained that it was possible to love someone while also recognizing that they weren't healthy to have in your life. The children seemed to understand this distinction better than I had initially expected. They loved their parents but didn't want to return to the chaos and anxiety that had characterized their previous home life. They missed certain aspects of their parents but appreciated the honesty and stability of their current situation. As the afternoon sun began to set and we packed up our beach supplies, Lily approached me with a question that caught me off guard. "Grandma Sarah, do you think Daddy will ever become a good person again?" The question revealed the depth of her emotional processing and her need to understand whether redemption was possible for people who had caused harm. I chose my words carefully, wanting to be honest without crushing her hope or her ability to believe in the possibility of positive change. "Lily, sweetheart, people can change if they really want to and if they're willing to do the hard work of becoming different. But they have to want to change for the right reasons, not just because they got in trouble." And even if someone changes, the people they hurt don't have to let them back into their lives just because they say they're sorry. Mason, who had been listening to our conversation while building one final sandcastle, looked up and said, "Like how we can forgive someone, but still stay safe from them?" The wisdom in his statement took my breath away. At 7 years old, he had grasped a concept that many adults struggled with: the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between letting go of anger and exposing yourself to further harm. Exactly like that, Mason. Forgiveness is something you do for yourself to let go of angry feelings. But trust has to be earned, and safety comes first. As we walked back to our car, I reflected on how much all of us had learned about healthy relationships over the past year. The children were developing emotional intelligence and boundary-setting skills that would protect them throughout their lives. Linda and I had discovered that it was possible to create chosen family bonds that were stronger and more reliable than biological connections. Most importantly, I had learned that it was never too late to change the trajectory of your life, to refuse to accept treatment that diminished your worth, to insist on relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. The drive home was peaceful, with both children tired from sun and salt water, content to rest against their car seats and share quiet observations about the families they had seen at the beach. As we pulled into our driveway and I looked at our house with its welcoming front porch and carefully tended garden, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life we had built together. A year ago, I had been a woman whose identity was entirely wrapped up in being needed by people who didn't value her. Today, I was someone who understood the difference between being needed and being used, between love and manipulation, between family obligations and family choices. David had been right when he told me I was never really a mother to him. The woman who had raised him had failed to teach him accountability, boundaries, or respect for others. She had created a man who believed he was entitled to whatever he wanted regardless of how his desires affected other people. But the woman I had become was a different kind of mother entirely. I was the kind of mother who protected her family by making difficult decisions, who chose truth over comfort, who understood that real love sometimes required saying no. I was the kind of mother who could raise children to be honest, responsible, and capable of genuine connection. As we settled into our evening routine of homework help, dinner preparation, and family conversation, I realized that David's cruel words on that Mother's Day morning had actually been a gift. They had forced me to examine what kind of mother I had been and what kind of person I wanted to become. I had proved him right by becoming the mother his children needed, the mother I should have been all along, the mother who understood that love without respect was just exploitation in disguise. And that transformation, painful as it had been, had given me the most precious Mother's Day gift of all. A family built on choice rather than obligation, on honesty rather than manipulation, on mutual care rather than one-sided sacrifice. Looking around our dinner table that evening, watching Linda help Mason with his math homework while Lily showed me her latest artistic creation, I knew that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Safe, honest, supportive, chosen. David had told me I was never really a mother to him, and I had spent a year proving him absolutely right. But in the process, I had discovered what kind of mother I was capable of being when given the chance to love people who valued that love appropriately. It was the best Mother's Day gift I had ever received. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.